It's a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, George Green. George is the Group Director of Pharmacodiagnostics at Bristol-Myers Squibb. And prior to joining BMS, George was also a part of Veridex, which is part of Johnson & Johnson. And by training, George is a microbiologist from The Ohio State University. And for those of you who practice Six Sigma, George is also a certified Six Sigma black belt. And more than that, he's my former mentor, so he means a great deal to me. So welcome, George. Thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for being invited to today's meeting, and it's been an interesting morning session and going to an early afternoon. With that said, I know it is early afternoon, right after lunch. If somebody feels like they need to go get a coffee, go ahead. I won't be insulted. So actually, we're going to change gears up a little bit here, and actually my talk and the next talk are going to focus a little bit more on the logistics of companion diagnostics development. And I think that this is a subject that's been evolving for, since I got into this business. And I think over the last 2 or 3 years, it's starting to get to something that's a little bit more standardized, a little bit more approachable. And the ways we manage between the pharma company and the diagnostic company is being sorted out. I think 6 to 8 years ago, it was very difficult to establish these relationships where both sides had a high probability of being successful. But I think going forward, I think that actually is, I think we've worked out ways to do that. Yeah, so this is me talking, not necessarily BMS in this case. But I think a lot of what was discussed this morning really does describe what the challenges in having a diagnostic program and working between two companies are. And one of the biggest elements that had to be addressed was the different business models between pharma and diagnostics. Pharma develops 1 or 2 products with really high margins and sells the heck out of it for 5 or 10 years. Diagnostics, they develop lots of stuff. They're all about menu, and they're looking to really have lots of products, very low margins. And they don't have the kind of money to invest that pharma companies have. So the cost, and it was mentioned earlier about opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is a huge deal to the diagnostic companies. Okay, the drug companies, it's really not about opportunity costs. So, well, it's a different kind of opportunity cost. It's about getting the drug successfully on the market as soon as possible to take advantage of and of course also help the patients. And treat patients in some really, significant diseases, especially, with immuno-oncology and some of the new drugs coming through, making some remarkable progress in that. But really, these are the stresses that we deal with in every day. And I think, I'm not going to go through everything on this, but it's not just the two companies. You also have other parties to the whole game. You've got the regulators who have guidelines out there. The guidelines, as we've talked about, are continually evolve. Europe is coming out with a huge revision to their guidelines. I was at a regulatory conference a couple months ago, and it was actually pretty frightening what they may do to the diagnostic industry in Europe and the ability to comply with that, what they're going to require. We've got the patients, the payers, the people that are true customers to these products, the people who actually gain benefit from these products, and what they're looking for out of this. And then within the companies, you have development teams, and again, very disparate requirements between the two groups, and they've got to come together at some level on this, on some core co-development team. So, and just digging into a little deeper, in a companion diagnostic development team, on the pharma side, you generally have some sort of a drug development team. Some companies have a diagnostic development team, some companies don't. It depends on how evolved and how big they want to commit to it. The diagnostic companies have their R&D, their commercial organizations, and their business development organization, really looking to make the deal and figure out how they're going to monetize this product. Okay? On the pharma side, then you get into these highly complicated development teams with the assay development, the drug development team, huge efforts in clinical and regulatory. And then, of course, on the diagnostic side, you've got more or less a conventional diagnostic development team, focused on clinical regulatory development, manufacturing, and all those areas. And all of a sudden, when you start to put this together, there's just dozens and dozens of people who are actually players in this, and you've got to satisfy every single one of them. And I'll click through this more quickly, but reality is, it expands from there. You may have a separate platform manufacturer, you have all your raw material providers. Frequently, pharmaceutical companies partner together, and you've got to manage both of their expectations. And so this is just literally, the co-development programs can involve hundreds of people who could influence the outcomes of it. And this is where, people like Chris and I and other people in this room have to really try to manage through things. So how do we do that? A big part of managing companion diagnostics programs is making sure you manage things up front. Align the goals of the programs. Make sure both companies are talking about what they want to get out of it. Making sure that you have a governance system that works, both at the tactical levels and at the strategic level. You have working groups that can actually get things done, get them done quickly, more in the biopharma, biotech model than in the big pharma, big diagnostic company model. Project management, I'm not going to talk a lot about that because the next talk is going to go into that. But project management is absolutely critical. You've got so many players, so many things to communicate that if it's not managed well, it's going to unravel very quickly. And my last point, and I think this really comes down to it, these are so complicated that there's no way to manage these programs without just communicating, having personal relationships, and working through stuff. It's not something that's going to be managed by a computer program. MS Project doesn't do it. A big part, and where everything starts with these programs, is generally with the contract. So what we found is that the contract is high level. It manages the relationship, legal issues, cost, IP, all the other stuff that has to be put down on paper. What it doesn't do, it really doesn't work out the teamwork and how the groups are going to work together. But it has these high level issues defined. But again, the best practice we've seen is that leave the details out. You establish joint teams to work together. Those teams work out the details, and they're able to be flexible as the program evolves, change how they work together if necessary. But they can build from the contract and then just go from there. Okay? The goals and the scope of the program are also very important because you really have to align on exactly what is it you want to accomplish and how far you're going to go on it. Frequently, the best thing to do with a team that's forming is just get them together in a room and let them fight out what exactly the goals are going to be and the scope of the program. A lot of times, things come out that neither side ever anticipated. And a lot of times, those are critical issues that, if not resolved, they could have undermined the program in the long run. The other piece of it is, if you look at the program and you think about schedules for the program, neither side really understands how it's going to play out until you get together and talk about it. And so you can decide what the milestones are jointly rather than trying to establish them up front. And I think that's another critical piece of it. Obviously, you need to do something in the contract, but again, going back to it, give yourself the flexibility in the contract that you can do what you need to do for the program. The other piece is change management. Accept it. These programs are really complicated. Things change constantly. And if there's not a system to manage through that, and there's not a relationship built to manage that change, you're going to have a lot of iterative work. You're going to have a lot of complications. Things are going to go to management or governance many times. We've all been through that stuff. We don't want any of that. And it's really, again, just to reiterate, I think the goals and scope exercise can be really critical to the success of a co-development program. This slide I left in here. I think it is important that the drug program and the drug companies and diagnostic companies understand each other's processes, their requirements from regulatory compliance, whatever. I will say, I think we're getting through this. I think to a large degree, the pharma side especially has started to learn what diagnostic companies are required to do. I think it was a big surprise at first how complicated diagnostic development is. But I think the more sophisticated pharma companies are really starting to get that and come to terms with all of the requirements and all the regulatory bodies and all the efforts they have to go through to actually get a diagnostic out there. There we go. So I mentioned earlier the milestones and developing milestones. It is something that I think needs to be left to the beginning of the program, not the contracting process. But really, how do you come to those milestones? You need to establish some sort of set of goals and some sort of path to what the ultimate program is going to look like. One way to do that is to talk about the intended use for the drug and the diagnostic, because really isn't that the end game? You know, we want to treat patients. We want to treat them well. You know, we want to treat them in a timely manner. All these things come together with the intended uses of the two products. It's a good way to go through that exercise. All these things start to come out of it. You know, what's your unmet medical need? What's the strategy for the therapeutic? You know, what resources are you need? What's the business plan for launching the drug and the diagnostic? You know, that can be a very complicated and sensitive area. But all these things can start to come out of that when you develop the intended use. It's also a great exercise to get people together and duke it out and really start to understand each other and understand how the program's going to go. I think this probably may be second nature to people who've been in this space, but it's worth stating that, you know, there needs to be some sort of system of governance that isn't just everybody gets to have a vote. There needs to be a process by which you have technical people working at a tactical level, you know, and if things need to be resolved or if there's higher level strategy issues, they need some place to go to resolve that stuff. It also helps because, you know, you get affirmation of what you're doing as you do it. And actually, I mean, if you're doing it right, managing upward is a great way to get what you want. And so a good way to look at it generally is you have some sort of executive level committee, call it whatever you want to, and they're really at the strategic level. They endorse strategy, maybe, you know, high level budget changes, things like that, resolving big issues. But it's really more important to have a development team that really builds a strategy and is responsible for execution of the program. And they really are the ones who should come up with the specifics and really use the governments only when, you know, the executive level governance when they need to. But some sort of structure like that, sometimes you put a third layer in there if you need to. Sometimes there's sub-teams. Sometimes you establish sub-teams for development and regulatory and clinical. All has to be, you know, structured for the complexity and the needs of the program. Something that frequently gets left to the last minute and is a big mistake is addressing commercialization. Both the medical and the commercial teams need to be brought in at the beginning of strategy development. Maybe they're not too busy in the middle of the program, but having that commercial strategy early on is really key to the success of that co-development program. The complexity of launch of a companion diagnostic product is just massive, okay? And you can fail very easily if you don't consider those things. So that's the formal stuff. Informally, you know, managing the alliance sometimes is necessary. You know, and sometimes it just needs to be talked out. Issues need to be talked out around how the program's running, how, you know, budget things like that, making sure that things go smoothly. So an alliance manager or somebody who's at least responsible for the alliance is an important element as well. And I think then we can't always forget that, look, each company needs to be successful on their own as well. So having teams that actually sit down and talk within the company, make sure everything that's being talked about jointly, is consistent with the overall company's strategy. So you need to maintain that internal focus as well, okay? And I think, well, yeah, I've already made that point. So just some working teams, and again, you know, from experience, you know, you don't always establish these, but it's ones to consider. Clearly, you know, you likely need some sort of development team unless it's a established product. Regulatory is, you know, an overriding requirement, starting, you know, very early in the program, you know, prior to clinical trials frequently. The clinical team, IP, often overlooked, especially in pharma companies. Pharma companies never think that there's IP around diagnostics until they actually run into it. You know, and then these other ones, supply chain commercial. Another key one is sample acquisition. That's a separate activity for development, as all diagnostic people know, but not everybody in pharma understands that. Okay? And then project management, I'll just touch on. As I said before, you can't ignore project management. You have multiple partners involved in these relationships. The only way to manage that effectively is to actually have a plan, stick to the plan. When it has to change, manage that change. But there needs to be an effective way to make sure that the program's on track. And all these things, this is just basic program management, but it's all it's way more critical when you have a relationship like this. So I probably went very quickly through that, but just a couple things to reinforce. I think the alignment between the companies is just, it's a never-ending challenge from the start of the program to the end of the program to maintain that alignment. And if you do an effective job of maintaining that alignment, the co-development program will likely be successful. okay? The degree of matrixing, is that a word? The amount of matrixing that you do across these programs is just insane. You know, you have multiple companies involved, multiple functions involved, you know, functions that are siloed within companies, you get siloing between companies. This just requires constant intervention and management to make sure that it's going effectively, okay? Governance, formal governance is important, but can't emphasize the importance of relationships, informal activities, and just plain communications. And, you know, finally, you know, success factors, which really was what this was all about, you know, alignment of goals, communications, accepting there's differences between the organizations and the teams, and really just always, you know, look for excellence in execution. So interestingly enough, there's nothing in there about process. I don't think that really, in my opinion, I don't think that really, we all do process. We all should be doing that as, you know, in our sleep. It's about the relationships and building a program that really matter. So